Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 25 of Series 7. And the question for today is Kantian ethics irredeemably flawed, or can its central principles be salvaged? The reading for today from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 6. My main philosophical concern is very practical. I'm asking the question, what can we do with our lives? Ethics can be said to have similar concerns, but classical ethics had different concerns to modern ethics. Kantian and modern ethics asks the question, how should we act, or what actions are ethical? Classical or Aristotelian ethics asks, what is the good or flourishing life of happiness? My concerns align much more with these classical questions, and that is part of my critique of Kantian ethics. Yet my approach differs from the classical in a number of ways. That is, I am presenting problems of life in terms of consciousness and finding answers in terms of value, and I answer in terms of an affirmation or principle of value leading to a certain adequacy of value. The purpose of these workshops is to work out and explain what that means. One consequence of this view is that value is the more general and explanatory category of which ethics is a part. So in this way, ethical principles are values which guide moral action. In religion, God is the believer's highest value, which gives meaning to life. And a meaningful life is also a worthwhile and valuable life. This means that the values of ethics, religion, meaning, and aesthetics must compete against each other, as well as that Kantian ethics must compete with Aristotelian, utilitarian, and other theories of ethics. And this is why we must examine the strengths, weakness, and the adequacy of Kantian ethics. Both Kant's philosophy and his ethics are notoriously complex and difficult to define. One shortcut sees Kant's ethics as a reformulation of Christian ethics of goodwill and the value of other people. Yet he wants to do this on the basis of reason without reference to a belief in God. He is, however, criticised in making tacit appeals to religious ideas in order to do this, such as resolving the unacceptable consequences of his injunctions in an afterlife. And on the question of religion, Kantian ethics has thereby been thought to share criticisms of Christianity. For example, a key idea in Kant's categorical imperative that we will discuss shortly is its humanity. But his idea of humanity conflicts with the idea of self-abnegation said to be found in religion. The idea is that we owe everything to God, which demeans and detracts from humanity. This is illustrated by Iris Murdoch, a Christian and Kantian who writes in such a spirit of human abnegation. She writes that a genuine sense of mortality enables us to see virtue as the only thing of worth, and the acceptance of our own nothingness is a spur to our concern with what is not ourselves, unquote. Nietzsche enforces the idea of abnegation in Christianity as slave morality that cannot achieve virtues of power. He claims it then can only take on traits of weakness in humility, submission, and obedience as its values. More specifically, Susan Wolf presents us with the idea of a Kantian moral saint who is lacking in humanity. Wolff cites Maria von Herbert's case of rigid adherence to honesty that doesn't lead to personal well-being. That is the kind of person whose every action is as morally good as possible. But that isn't a model of well-being that will be good or desirable to strive for. I will return to such practical failings of Kant's ethics shortly, but I want to criticize its underlying principles. And one key or pivotal idea in Kant's ethics is the idea of reason, which is applied in different ways. And Kant's applications of reason are subject to certain criticisms, such as 1. Kant tacitly appeals to religious values and cultural prejudices that are unjustified by reason. He assumes a moral order implicit in religion and, as noted, needs an afterlife to rectify bad consequences. Yet Kant presupposed a universal moral order. This is an understandable assumption. It seems that something about morals must be universal in order for it to be moral. But we will look at what it is about morals that is universal. 2. There is a problem in using reason to establish moral values exemplified in Hume's law or principle. Hume argued that a prescriptive ought can't be derived from a factual is, nor morals from reason. Hume's principle has never been unseated and thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. And on reading Hume, Kant said that he had been awoken from a dogmatic slumber. 3. Another problem for reason is the motivational impotence of cognition. This is the supposition that a certain conception of things is, by itself, sufficient to motivate moral action. Kant holds that we ought to follow the moral law just because we understand that the moral law is right. And because we understand that the moral law is right, it is our duty to practice it. We will need to say more about this later. Yet, like everyone else, as well as great thinkers, Kant was surprisingly limited by the ideas of his era. For example, it's often said that one could hardly find anyone who didn't believe in God in pre-Renaissance times. In Kant's era, truth, fact, and universality as an aspect of reason were highly prized due to their rarity. This was an age in conflict with superstition, witchcraft, and rampant erroneous understanding of the world. Conversely, Renaissance reason, science, and human potential were greatly regarded. Reason was thereby thought of as an unmitigated good, without much critical redress. Kant wrote 2 huge books to address this problem: The Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Practical Reason. These were great but seminal works without the weight of modern perspectives on reason and logic. So Kant attempted to establish ethics on, and as we will see again, a limited conception of reason. But given these and other failings, we might ask the question, why bother to examine Kantian ethics? It's because his perspective of both ethics and philosophy was enormously encompassing and innovative. It's often said that the student can't circumvent Kant. You have to go through him and understand him. You need to understand what the problems are and even understand the mistakes that Kant made. It can even be said that Kant was a genius, even though he was a flawed genius. He was attempting to reconcile and integrate aspects of moral life that previously hadn't been synthesized. He wrestled with the problem of how subjective moral states could be objective. This was central to Kant's project to explain how moral objectivity could be binding on us. And he did this with reason, which was both objective and an integral part of the mind. Reason was almost unchallenged in his day as the primary or only normative integer. This and other ambiguities produced deep tensions in Kant between the elements he is seeking to synthesize. The tensions are between an affirmation of humanity and its possible abnegation. They are between reason and hidden presuppositions in religion and cultural intuitions. And reconciliation is sought between the universal and the individual, and thereby also between the objective and the subjective. But to get to the heart of Kant's moral philosophy, we have to examine his categorical imperative. Kant's categorical imperative has three aspects. One, the universality of reason. I quote, "Always act so that your action becomes a universal law." Two, the humanity aspect is to always treat humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And three, autonomy is expressed in free choice, that is, we must choose to give the moral law to ourselves. Kant distinguished his categorical imperatives from hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives can only hold on certain circumstances, that is, if they obtain. Categorical imperatives are principles that always must be followed and are a priori and self-validating, like 2 + 2 = 4, Aristotle's principles of logic, the cogito ergo sum, and in my case, the wheels of value. The role of reason in Kant's categorical imperative is thereby both crucial and disputed, classically by Hume. But it has been questioned more recently by Ian McFurtridge, Philippa Foot, and John McDowell. Foot, for example, doubts that categorical imperative is in fact a categorical imperative, and that it is instead a hypothetical imperative. That is, Kant's moral imperative is only an imperative on some prior premise, like a feeling. Yet the three aspects of Kant's moral philosophy are known as his universality, his humanity, and his autonomy. We can now discuss these three aspects of his categorical imperative, starting with humanity. Kant's notion of humanity was the second aspect of his categorical imperative. Together with his respect for autonomy as human choice, Kant's humanity seems to be authentic. This is reinforced by his view of enlightenment as the intellectual independence, maturity, and courage to use the knowledge of who we are. More explicitly, the notion of humanity in Kant is expressed as treating people as ends in themselves. And treating people as ends in themselves is also to recognize people as having intrinsic value. Yet an explanation of another person's intrinsic value can be found in his rationality. That is, the recognition of another's intrinsic value is the universalization of one's own intrinsic value. But it's questionable whether universalization is an adequate appreciation of intrinsic value. The earlier negative association of Kant's relation to Christianity also bears upon the idea of intrinsic value. That is, Kant's attribution of intrinsic value to people is often thought to derive from the Christian incarnation, where God becomes man and that man is made in the image of God. But these criticisms are mild compared to Kant's association with Christian endorsement of slavery and homophobia. Hans-Georg Müller of Macau University also points out Kant's prejudices in his The Metaphysics of Morals. Here, Kant strongly advocates the death penalty and holds homosexuality to be intolerable. These prejudices might simply be excused, even for a philosopher, as reflecting social norms. But he seems to contradict all three of his principles in holding that servants can be controlled by force. That is, they don't have the freedom of employment, and if they run away, they should be brought back by force. Worse still, killing illegitimate children shouldn't be considered murder, as it's like disposing of contraband. This advice appears to contradict Kant's principle of humanity to treat people as ends rather than means. His other views, like never lying and absolute impartiality between family and strangers, also seem inhuman. They indicate a fanaticism that puts rules and reason above people. We might look, though, to Kant's view of human autonomy for a more positive picture. Ronald Dworkin takes such a positive view when he writes that Kant's moral philosophy only seems to be the paradigm of self-abnegation. Yet he says that with freedom and dignity, it becomes a morality of self-affirmation. But the above facts and further comments below challenge this view. The idea of autonomy or freedom expresses the third aspect of Kant's categorical imperative. Kant's autonomy means that we must choose to give ourselves the moral law. Here, autonomy anticipates the modern and existentialist emphasis on individuality, freedom and choice. But again, associations with existentialism, as well as with Christianity, come at a price. For example, Hubert Dreyfus criticizes both Kantian and Sartrean autonomy in seeking to impose itself on the world. Yet Kantian autonomy can also be an appropriate moderation of religious passivity. Kant was a Christian, but he held that morals must be based on free and informed choice, not God's authority. Again, unlike Greek and Judaic ethics, Christian and Kantian ethics also stress choice and intention. Intention or goodwill is of crucial significance in Kantian ethics. For example, Kant writes, "Nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good except a good will." And I'll briefly note here the compatibility of this goodwill with the will to value as a final principle. It follows that Kant paid particular attention to the quality and the qualification of intention and choice. It must be free and without constraint, it must be informed by reason, and it must be correctly motivated and not prudential. In Kant's view, motivations from personal gain, expediency or inclination are not moral. For example, helping people because you really enjoy helping people is, in Kant's view, amoral, not moral. So acting on inclination to do good is oddly lacking and is a criticism of Kantian ethics. But on virtue theory ethics, Kantian acts of will or intention are regarded as only attempts to do good. Aristotle's virtue ethics sees morality as acting out of good character or disposition. Only acts that spring naturally from character are regarded as genuine expressions of good. This accords with the modern understanding of authenticity and counts against Kantian ethics. But we can also understand how inclinations and feelings are sometimes inappropriate in ethical theory and practice. The question is how to know when to overlook feelings and when to act on them. My view is that feelings are crucial as symptoms of moral action, but must be rejected as criteria. And Kant had a similar view about happiness as a consequence, not a goal of moral action. But I don't have time to develop these views here. Yet the issue of feelings immediately raises the question of reason that is central to Kant's ethics. The question to be posed is whether Kant's reason ameliorates his problems, or is it what causes them? To answer this question, we can reiterate that Kant wanted to establish universal moral laws based on reason, like those of science. But the relation between reason and moral values is fraught with difficulties that continue today. We have previously mentioned problems posed by Hume as well as Moore and Mackey. Nietzsche had his own critiques of reason and a supposed inviolable value of truth. And today Simon Blackburn can speak of the tyranny of rationalism. But for Kant, the authority of morality is based on reason. Reason that is both a capacity within us and a universal. And therein lies our capacities of responsibility, reasons for action, and motives that determine moral worth. And that responsibility and reason for action constitute the motive for action that Kant calls duty. And we must perform our duty just because it is right. And Kant explains that doing our duty just because it's right is a matter of pure reason alone. Cognitivists like Kant explain morals and motivation primarily in terms of reason and certain conceptions of things. Hume represents the non-cognitivist view, which seeks explanations primarily in terms of affect and feeling. John McDowell tried to explain motivating cognitive capacities as favourable light or perceptual capacity. But favourable light or perceptual capacity seem to need explanations with non-cognitive value. We can thereby find in Kant, as well as for ourselves, at least three aspects of reason. One, the usual meaning of reason as thinking about means to an end. Two, reason as denoting the significance of fact or a certain conception of things. And three, reason as an expression of universality, as in mathematics, logic, or non-contradiction. In Kant's categorical imperative, formulated in its version as universal law, Kant holds that one should act only on a maxim that one could will to be a universal law. This injunction immediately raises the question of the kind of restrictions that a rational will imposes. No doubt that Kant has a universal standard of reason in mind, but that can nevertheless be questioned. And what counts as a valid reason for action must also be subject to interpretation. I previously noted the difference between desire-based and value-based theories of reason, and the relative strength of reasons is also sometimes quoted in this respect. Yet for Kant, for a maxim to be a universal law, it is clear that it cannot be incoherent or contradictory. Examples of such incoherence or contradictoriness are Kant's absolute prohibitions on lying and suicide. But these examples, raise a further question of how Kant's universalization is to be applied. He insists that there can only be one categorical imperative at our highest level of practical reasoning. This view implies the kind of account criticized by Alan Wood of moral theory as the attempt to formulate precise principles from which we can rigorously derive a set of conclusions about what to do in all actual or imaginary cases. I leave it as a matter of judgment as to whether such an account, without exception or moderation, is plausible. But to assist that judgment, I will draw attention to problems of universality for any practical system. In engineering, for example, it's impossible to design anything from a purely theoretical basis. Designs of engines, cars or rockets are made through a process of continual rectification and development. Similar rectifications must be expected in the much more complex human world of ethics. But Kant believes that his premise is absolutely correct and all-encompassing. These considerations lead me to the view that rather than formulating universal maxims, we should be making individual judgments depending on circumstances. Yet this criticism doesn't eliminate the possibility of purely formal principles as I have advocated. Moreover, something about ethics must be universal in order to justify our most basic moral intuitions. Otherwise, ethics is subject to ethical inversion of Sartre's Jean Genet, good be my evil, evil be my good. Contingent factors like genetics, social convention can't prevent the possibility of ethical inversion. Kant's answer that we are questioning was to establish ethics on the objectivity of reason. Others, like Foucault and myself, are attempting to find a foundation of value in consciousness. Foucault goes on to speak of the care of the self in complex socio-political contexts. For myself, I look to structures of consciousness to provide universals that involve value. That is, I argue that consciousness exists and therefore must have properties, and that these properties are the parameters of human existence. I've argued for the coexistence of consciousness and value elsewhere. Yet Kant also produced the Copernican revolution, with consciousness having an active role in understanding. But Kant's interest in consciousness was about epistemology and knowledge rather than about value and ethics. But with respect to applied or material content of moral action, as the engineering example indicated, complete universalization, objectivity or standardization seems to be a rationalist dream, whether based on either reason or on structures of consciousness. A complete universalization of moral action may also be neither possible or desirable. For example, Kant advocated complete objectivity and impartiality when dealing with people. This sounds good, but incurs the problem of moral distancing in treating family and strangers alike. In choosing between the death of my father and a stranger, humanity calls me to choose a stranger. But Kant would want me to weigh their moral value as equals. An earlier example was that Kant also advocated that we must never lie, not just sometimes, but always. He endorsed this view in an essay entitled "On a Supposed Right to Tell Lies from Benevolent Motives." He argues that even white lies are never acceptable even to an axeman at the door. There can be no exceptions because, in Kant's view, the moral law is the law. It can't be violated. Kant sees reason exclusively, and he emphasized his clarity and certainty with the scientific metaphor. I quote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." This view of clarity and certainty has been described as an apodictic method of seeking unquestionable truth. This method begins with absolute principles or premises that can't be challenged or changed. But this apodictic thinking led Kant into untenable presuppositions about reason, universality, and morality. And apodictic thinking then prevents contingent judgments being made for particular cases. A similar and well-known critique of Kantian rigidities was also made by Elizabeth Anscombe. She argued that the ideas of duty, obligation, and law as given by God have weakened or have been rejected, and she advocated replacing these principles with particular virtues as held by Aristotle. But on Kantian precepts, we ought to follow the moral law just because we understand that the law is right. And because we understand that the moral law is right, it is our duty to practice it. But against Hume's is-ought constraint, this derives the moral law of duty from the fact or understanding of the moral law. This may be an admirable attempt to reach an intuitively justifiable conclusion, but it hasn't gone unchallenged. Yet it doesn't mean that Kantian ethics can't be reconfigured into a more acceptable form. Derek Parfit attempted to do this with a form of Kantian contractualism. But for many of us, Kantian contractualism is a contradiction in terms, and Parfit's unificatory aspirations have also been widely questioned. Yet mitigating a blunt application of cognitive motivation, Hilary Putnam finds the roots of Kantian duty in the dignity of obeying the moral law, that is, the dignity of giving myself a law that all rational beings can give themselves, the dignity of autonomy. Then Kant's dignity derives from choosing and affirming the moral law in the form of his categorical imperative. Kant's view of duty as respect for the moral law connects it to dignity and thereby to value and also to self-value. So we might not accept the inescapability of Kant's moral law as the categorical imperative, but we might accept having a reason to find value in a broader affirmation of truth. That is, Kant holds that we must obey because it is right or true, yet the truth is a more inescapable property for human will than the categorical imperative. And as previously noted, and as implied by Putnam, the significance of truth derives from its reflected value onto the agent. And the will to truth is also a better, if not a conclusive, candidate of both universality and value. In addition, I previously argued how a will to value can produce normative moral action. But that isn't the kind of universally uniform action that Kant is looking for. As an explanation of morality, the will to truth also reflects values like dignity back onto the agent. In this way, Kantian ethics could be expressed in terms of a will to value or the pursuit of value. But this reinterpretation is contentious and wouldn't be accepted by neo-Kantians. This is because Kant holds that we must choose affirm and act on the moral law because it is right. But we must ask again, what is it about the moral law being right that compels us to act? There are problems about cognition and it compelling us to act just because it is right or true, such as we don't have direct access to truth, as Kant himself always also held. Then if truth isn't available to motivate us, we might be motivated by sincere belief. But sincere belief can be had about any number of things, but most compellingly about the will to truth. Yet there is much more to say about the relation between truth and value that can be said here. But this view at least challenges the claimed primacy of Kant's categorical imperative. Neo-Kantians like W.D. Ross have attempted to rescue Kantian ethics as an objective system of right or wrong. In response to the is-ought problem, Ross regarded value as supervenient upon certain non-evaluative features, such as a sensitivity to facts which mirrors McDowell's favourable light. And against the pluralism that I advocate, Ross attributed absolute priority of morals over all other concerns. He also remodelled Kant's immutable duties into conditional obligations or prima facie duties. These were enforceable only under tight right circumstances in the absence of overwhelming detriment. But this qualification was bought at the cost of multiple prima facie duties competing against each other. To resolve this conflict, Ross said that we should obey the stronger duty of the greatest prima facie rightness. But in the real world, it isn't possible to determine which duties are prima facie or take precedence. So Ross returned to the idea that selection and precedence of prima facie duties are self-evident and obvious. But practical difficulties show that they are not always self-evident or obvious. And in order for prima facie obligations to be credible, they must be both very few and be exceedingly compelling, that is, like the will to truth and the will to value. Christine Kosgaard is another neo-Kantian who reconfigures Kant's account of objectivity. That is, she reconstrues practical reason to produce objective imperatives defined by the problems that they resolve. For example, the problem of sitting down can be resolved by the existence of a seat. Objects such as seats are perspective dependent in the sense given by both Kosgaard and Bernard Williams, but they have objective existence in the world and can provide objective solutions. This shows how some things might be construed as objective, but only perspectively, and this is a long way from demonstrating Kant's universal moral norms. In conclusion, we can ask, can neo-Kantians redeem Kantian ethics, or can such tinkering never put it right? Kant's critiques of pure and practical reasons were groundbreaking, but had less than complete success. And we saw that his conceptions of reason, universality and objectivity were at the heart of the problem. Kant had great appreciation of the complexities of theory, but had little appreciation of the complexities of life. He lived his entire life in the city of Königsberg, never married, and people set their clocks by his walks. It's also sometimes mentioned that he was a Prussian, supposedly explaining his emphasis on duty. His interest in consciousness is prescient, but is epistemological and is a precondition of rationality and perception. In this way, Kant has sometimes been described as a progenitor of phenomenology, and like Descartes and Locke, he couldn't regard consciousness as a foundational moral framework. Yet we saw that Kant's embrace of universality and his ambivalence about feelings had certain merits, but he had to omit both consciousness and value despite his appreciation of mind in epistemology. With respect to value, his aesthetic consists of a rationalist framework of time and space, and his renowned categories of human thought makes no mention of graduation. So my main criticism of Kant's ethics is thereby that it is rationalist and one-dimensional. It is one-dimensional because it views the complexities of life through a single rationalist prism. He ignores mitigating circumstances, competing values, and different levels of awareness. He affirms the classical unity of consciousness and thereby doesn't consider its divisibility. For example, Kant's one-dimensional view of people as ends in themselves is given as a fact, not subject to elaboration. And for Kant, intrinsic value depends on people's rationality, not the affirmation or enhancement of value. So we can't consider ethics for infants, for animals, or for non-rational adult humans. So the genius of Kant has been overtaken by the philosophical developments of the modern world. But to understand either of them, an understanding of Kant is a preparatory requirement. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or Meetup.